Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lori Trina's on there if you need to text her and ask a question. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts and the technology and the magic it does all be pleasing in your sight. Amen. Well, hello there and welcome. My name is Phil Ruge-Jones. I am a long-term member of the Network of Biblical Storytellers. I'm a graduate of the Academy for Biblical Storytelling, and I'm a pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. My biggest claim to fame in relation to the Gospel of Mark is that I know it by heart and I tell it, and you'll get to see a video recorded portions of me doing that tonight. Can we go to the top of that, Lori? So Lori Ruge-Jones is my facilitator. I think if you do it on the desktop, it'll.
Yeah, I had to find it. Hold on. I'm gonna stop sharing. That just is easier. And then go.
During this whole time, if there's any questions you have or comments you have, you can type them in the chat. The chat looks like this. It's on the bottom of your screen. If you click on it, a box will come up either on the side or maybe pop up in the middle of your window, and you can type your comments in. And my wife Lori is my facilitator. She's reading those comments, and at the end she'll be able to summarize some of them, or maybe we'll call some of you up on the stage to raise your questions or make your comments directly. Lori, can we go to the next 2 slides? So I'm going to mention the objectives of what I want to accomplish during this next hour or so with you, and then we will find out a little bit about who's here. So there are 4 things I'd like to accomplish. The primary one are the first 2, to think about Mark's context and our own, and how understanding the interrelationship of those 2 might help us to better understand the gospel itself. And since I only have 45 minutes, I'm not going to cover every theme in the Gospel of Mark, but we will focus on one theme, and I'll let that be a surprise when we get to it. And I'm going to encourage you to continue what you experience in this hour together by coming to the festival gathering, the virtual festival gathering we'll have on the last 2 days of this month. And then finally, I'll point you to where you can get some resources. There is a PowerPoint summary sheet, one of those with 6 of the boxes on each side of the page, and that's on the NBSI webpage right beneath my photo and this event page. You can grab that if you want to write notes on that. And at the end, there's also a resource list there, and that might be something you'll want to get after we're all done. What I'd like to do now is understand a little bit better who's in the house. There are 43 of you right now. And so I'm going to ask my facilitator to put a poll up, and you all can click on the X's or on the squares that fit who you are. And in this one, you can choose more than one. And so I'll let you look at that and do some clicking. You're doing great.
Okay.
All right, we got most of you to vote. That's good. And it might be Lori and I that didn't vote. So we might have had 100%. It looks like we have a nice balance. We have about a fifth of us who are coming in for our first time encountering NBSI. A little less than that who were gone but are back, and a bunch who are well acquainted with us. Many biblical storytellers, more than we have, that are affiliated with NBSI, and others still waiting for that joy. When I look at the amount of you that are preachers, I can tell that storytelling will be more key to think about in terms of this presentation. And so that sounds like that's the motive for many of you being here. All right, so thank you for giving us a little feel for the room. We're going to move on now and to that second point, and
he said it.
And talk about the context that I perceive as important in the Gospel of Mark.
By the way,
There are four elements that I think are real important, and I will touch on those. The Gospel of Mark was probably written around 70 CE. It was a time when the people of Jesus' land had become tired of the occupation by the Romans. They had their lives controlled in many ways. 1,000 indignities visited on them. And so some of them revolted violently, trying to throw the Romans from the land. Rome responded with greater violence, and a historian of the time, Josephus, says over 1 million Jews were killed in that moment. Many of them killed by crucifixion. Due process didn't matter. So when I think of the cross, I think of Jesus, because he's the person I know who was crucified. The original hearers may have known family members, friends, men, women, children, some of whom revolted and some who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the grief that was involved in this utter destruction is part of what they're processing through telling the story of the Gospel of Mark. The second point that I think is really important is that part of Rome's response was to destroy the temple, destroy the place where God was encountered and where their life of faith was processed. And so they suddenly had to find a way to think about God outside of this central organizing space that they had. They didn't start from scratch, but that rather they drew on the traditions of Israel and expanded on them in relation to the life of Christ. A third component that I believe was important is that people in general in this time, so it's not specific to that time, although war always aggravates these things, many of them lived a subsistence life. They had enough food for the day and hopefully enough to carry them into the next day, but hunger and poverty was a widespread issue. And then finally, as is the case when there is poverty and hunger, disease also was rampant. And thus the healing stories that talk of Jesus's power in that domain are really important. I think these moments, can you go to the next slide, Laurie, connect well with dimensions of our own life at this specific time we're in. We live in a time where revolt and uprisings are a real thing, and strong powers respond to those who are revolting, are in revolt. I think it's fair to say that the issues of where our worship space is, although our churches weren't destroyed, many of us at least are not finding it possible to gather in those as we once did, to process what God is up to in our life and to have a structured encounter with God. And so there's that element. Economic insecurity is much higher than it was 6 months ago. And of course, the threat of disease is lurking everywhere and constantly on our minds. And so these 4 dimensions, I think, relate really closely to the context that Jesus himself was addressing. And I'd like to know, in terms of those 4 things, or maybe something else, what is first and foremost on your mind? Where do you find your heart lingering in terms of the challenges of our day? And so I'm going to ask Lori to put up another poll, and this time you only get to pick one of these. Which one do you think is most weighing upon you? All right, I'll give you just a couple more seconds. Good percentage you've already voted. If you're on Facebook and you're watching this, you can't vote, I'm sorry. But you can watch it happen, and feel free to chat amongst yourselves on there. We're staying on the Zoom format in terms of the leadership of this event, but certainly you all come with your own resources and can engage each other in the chat portion of Facebook. And I'll probably go back and see what you said. So as you can see, the primary one of these that this particular group highlighted was the struggle between disease and wellness. The dynamics of uprising and responses to them also weighs heavily on our hearts. But all of these elements and some mystery 12% were also important. If you want to fill in your co-learners on what those 12% are, you can feel free to do that in the chat portion. The chat is down at the bottom of your box. It looks like this, and then a window will pop up and you can type your messages to others. Can you take that poll down, Lori? Maybe I can. All right. So Jesus's response to this is to proclaim the good news. And a key element of that good news is the kingdom of God. Can we go to the next slide, please? Or the Basileia tou Theou. I think it's important to realize that this is about what God is doing, that God is intervening in the world to bring about transformation, that this is over and against. So the word Basileia, the kingdom of God or the empire of God or the rule of God, is playing over and against the Roman Empire. So it's the same word, and so it sets up a tension between the two. I could say a lot more about the empire of God, but since I only have 45 minutes, I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to, first of all, admit some folks who just showed up. And then I'm going to talk about where I think there's a really fruitful place to go. And for those of you who know the Gospel of Mark, it may surprise you that I think Mark's theology of resurrection is really helpful to process the world we're in at this time. That might surprise some people because some people think that Mark's theology of resurrection is the least developed of all the Gospels. And so I'll walk you through why I don't think that's the case And we'll begin with looking at the resurrection story from the Gospel of Mark. And so we're going to watch a video of me telling it that was produced by Onkos Films. Very early the next day, the day after the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, rose and bought aromatic oil so that they might go and anoint the body of Jesus. And very early in the morning, as the sun was coming up, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, and Salome went with the aromatic oils. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll the stone away from the door of the grave for us?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled away, and it was large. And entering into the grave, they saw a young lad seated in white at the right hand, and they panicked. And he said, "You're seeking Jesus, that Nazarene who was crucified. He's not here. Look, the spot they laid him. But go and tell the others, even Rock. Look, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he said." The women went out of the tomb. Terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone at all. They were afraid because all right, so that's the crazy ending of the Gospel of Mark in the oldest text that we have access to. Later witnesses to Jesus added other stories to kind of wrap it up and make it feel a bit tighter. But the oldest manuscripts ended in this kind of mid-sentence way. What Jason and I, my videographer and I, were going for when we created that ending of the film was like, Rome, cut the connection. They're trying to cut off this story. And when we first were publishing that, people were writing back to us and saying, "I got a defective copy of the of your video. It freaks out at the end and doesn't finish." But that was actually intentional on our behalf. So it ends kind of without much resolution, with tensions still deeply present in the gospel, and without easy answers. And to me, that's an essential component of the theology of resurrection that Mark offers. And so I would suggest that as you're telling the stories of the Gospel of Mark, proclaim it uneasy with facile fixes, right? And be as comfortable as you can with the kind of tensions that are not only in the gospel, but that we experience every day of our lives. And I think that will create a truer telling of the gospel for your audiences. The next thing I want to look at, and I'm sorry the video probably doesn't stream as well as if we were in the same room together, but hopefully there's enough there you can get the idea. If the ending gives us an idea of Mark's theology of resurrection, the beginning is often in ancient manuscripts where you would set out the themes for the whole thing. So they weren't so worried about spoiler alerts. And so if we pay attention to the very beginning of Mark's gospel, we can get some more senses of what I see as the resurrection themes that he's developing. Lori, can we do that? Of the good news of Jesus, the anointed one, the Son of God. Just as it was written in the prophet Isaiah, "Look, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will pave your way." The voice of one crying out in the desert, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make his path direct." And it was so, John baptizing in the desert, proclaiming a baptism of turning around for the pardon of sins. And the whole Judean countryside and all the Jerusalemites were coming out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan, publicly admitting their sins. Now John was clothed in camel's hair. He had a leather band around his waist, and he ate cave crickets and wild honey. And he was saying, the one coming after me is more powerful than I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the strap of his sandal. I baptize you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. And it was so. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and he was baptized by John in the Jordan. And as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heaven being ripped open, and the Spirit, like a dove, coming down on him. And there was a voice from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am so pleased." And the Spirit drove him into the desert, and he was in the desert for 40 days, tested by Satan, surrounded by wild beasts, and angels were serving him. Now after... All right, thank you, Laurie. So again, what we see is this combination of a really sacred moment, but in the midst of temptation, or temptation and struggle, right? So this voice of God speaking to him, the barrier between God and heaven is destroyed, and then immediately he's sent out to face trials in the desert. I think it's not an accident that the very first story in the Gospel of Mark is a baptismal story. And my suspicion is that one of the key ways that this gospel was used in the early Jesus movement was for people who are on the verge of committing themselves to being a follower of Jesus. And it was kind of like a commencement speech before they became baptized. So they're sitting there in their robes, waiting for the baptismal moment, and the storyteller gets up and tells the whole Gospel of Mark, which, depending upon one's speed, takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And it's saying, before you commit to being a follower of Jesus, let's just go over one more time what that's about. And so the very first word, which I think was a little garbled in our listening today, is the beginning. And for some people, the beginning refers to, well, here's the prologue of the gospel that we're going to give you, the beginning of the good news. Or some people say, no, the whole gospel is the beginning of the good news, and the life of the faithful after that resurrection story we heard, well, that's the next stage after the beginning. And it's probably both those things at the same time, and evoking Genesis 1 themes. In the beginning, God created. But another component, I think, is that the storyteller is looking at these people about to begin their baptismal life and their following of Jesus in a committed and public way. And so the storyteller is looking them in their eyes and saying, for you today, this is the beginning of the good news. Fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. We know that by this time, the Apostle Paul is already writing about baptism as a dying and rising. And you can even get that sense. Jesus goes down into the water and then he comes up out of the water. And so I think that, again, this is a resurrection motif, a little more subtle than the other one that is being played upon. Can you go to the next slide, Lori? So there's two key so my surprising thing, right, that resurrection is going to be the key to understanding the Gospel of Mark. There's two terms that are used for the resurrection theme. There's no way you can make that bigger, Lori, so that it's just the images, the central thing instead of the whole desktop. It may or may not be possible. That's better, thank you. There are two resurrection words. There's Gerthane, which is located here. Can you see my arrow when I circle it like that? Maybe not. And on a Stenai, and they're two different words that are used throughout the Gospel of Mark, but they have fairly similar meanings. And so I just want to alert you to that. In the story where the young man in the tomb announces that Jesus is raised, the word he uses the first. But when Jesus predicts his suffering, death, and resurrection 3 times in the middle section of Mark, he uses the other word. Right? So just keep that in mind. And what I want to look at now are other texts in the Gospel of Mark where one of those 2 words is being used. And my belief is that sometimes they're just translated as somebody got up or stood up. But I think that Mark has sown throughout his gospel stories that get at different dimensions of what it means to be raised in Christ. And so the very first time after the baptismal story that we come across one of these words is the first healing miracle that Jesus does right after he did an exorcism. He's in the mother-in-law of Peter's house, and she has a fever, if you recall, and he grasps her hand and he raises her up, and she begins to serve him. And so there's this little resurrection image. He raises her up. In the very next chapter, there are 2 instances of this kind of motion upwards. There's the story where the friends rip a hole in the roof and lower down their friend who is a paralytic. And Jesus has a conversation with the people who are gathered there about his authority to forgive and to heal. And in the end, he tells the man who is paralyzed, lying at his feet on a mat, he says, "Rise, take up your mat and walk." And he rose, and picking up his mat, he walked out in front of them all. Right? So another resurrection in daily life story. And then also in the same chapter, just shortly after that, Levi is sitting at a tax booth. Jesus comes and calls him, and he rose. It's the other resurrection word. He rose and followed Jesus. So if you think about the values that are embedded in these stories, what does resurrection look like? It looks like being healed, being freed from that, which is tormenting you from within, a fever, and being freed up in order to serve others. It's about being totally dependent on others to go anywhere, and being freed for movement and freed of sins. And it's about moving from being a tax collector, a collaborator with Rome, and to being one who shows hospitality with Jesus and the community, and who confesses Jesus as a friend of sinners. And so there's this turning, the story is suggesting, turning from death toward these dimensions of life. Remember, you're free to write comments or questions in the chat feature if you're on the Zoom, and Lori will be looking at those, and if I don't take too long, we'll be able to go to them. Can we go to the next slide, Lori? We'll go through these 4 more stories with resurrection. Jesus is in the synagogue. There's a man there with a withered hand, and Jesus tells him, "Rise up, come to the center." And so it's about moving from the margins to the center and experiencing wholeness. There is a parable that Jesus tells, one of his primary ways of teaching, where he talks about a person who sleeps and rises night and day, and while that's happening, God is mysteriously bringing growth to the seeds that were sown. And so resurrection looks like trusting in God, letting go, resting in confidence in God. We all know how difficult that is these days as we wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And realizing that you're not God, but God is God, and God is the one who will bring the growth. You might have heard Anne Lamott say, the major difference between me and God is God never gets confused and thinks that he's me, right? Whereas she has issues in the other direction. There's a story of Jesus in the boat going across the sea when a storm comes up, and Jesus is in the back practicing that utter confidence and trust in God. He's sleeping. They wake him up, and we're told that he rises up and he rebukes the wind. Silence, shut up. And there was a great calm, right? And so it's about resurrection in daily life is about when chaos is overwhelming you, God bringing calm and peace in the midst of that. There's one of the stories that is most clearly an actual resurrection story in the Gospel of Mark. There's this story where that's two stories entangled: a woman with a flow of blood for 12 years and a little 12-year-old girl who's dying. Jesus goes through, and healing comes to the woman with a flow of blood for 12 years. She demonstrates to the little girl's father what trust looks like. And so he goes with Jesus, and Jesus grasps the little girl's hand and he says, Talitha kum, which means, I say to you, little girl, rise. And she rose. Now, if you look at that, the Greek in those two, you can see that in this particular example, and the very next one we'll look at, both of those Greek words for resurrection were used, suggesting that they're very closely aligned. And so resurrection is about pushing back the powers of death and restoring people to life, but it's also about, in this, the whole story that's there, about the restoration of community. Two people, an unclean woman and a leader of the synagogue and his family, are brought together in a way they normally wouldn't have in daily communal life. Next one, Laurie. And then there's a healing of a young man who's possessed by a demon. This is the one that has a young man who stiffens up and foams at the mouth, and the demon or the unclean spirit tries to throw him in water or fire in order to destroy him. Remember his father's great cry, I trust, help my lack of trust, or I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus grasps him by the hand when he's lying there on the ground looking like a corpse and raises him up. And again, you see there, both of those verbs are used in that story. And so what does it mean to be resurrected in daily life? It's to the powers of evil that occupy us, to have those driven out, and to be turned from that which seeks to destroy us toward that which is life. There's the story of Bartimaeus, who was a beggar, and a man who is blind sitting by the roadside. He hears about Jesus. He calls out to him, and Jesus tells the people to bring him to him, and they say, take courage, rise, he's calling you. And he rises up, goes to Jesus. His sight is restored, and from that day on, he follows Jesus. So what does resurrection look like? It's moving from that kind of dependence and that he had experienced to being an actor, an agent, and a participant in the reign of God, the empire of God that is unfolding in, with, under, and around Jesus. And then one last story is when Jesus is in the garden and he's praying with greatly weighed down, and he says, you know, if this cup can pass from me, and the cup doesn't get to pass from him, when he's turned and comes back to his disciples and knows that the hour has come, he tells them, rise, let's go, the one handing me over has arrived. And so what does resurrection look like? It's having the courage to face the challenges that are in front of you, boldly and trusting in God. All right. So what I hope you can see is, in all these resurrection stories, the little resurrection stories that are sown throughout the gospel, there's a real profound texture to it. Resurrection doesn't always mean the same thing. It means different things in each of these stories. And even when a bunch of them are healing stories, the dimensions are different. Sometimes it's move from paralysis to movement. Forgiveness is involved there, from collaboration to solidarity, right? And so there's all sorts of different dimensions and richness to this understanding of resurrection. It's so subtle in there that if you're not looking for it, you might miss it. And so I'm inviting you, as you're telling these stories and proclaiming them, to keep your eyes open for resurrection. I believe, as somebody who tells the whole gospel, that these moments where the actual words are used, these sonic echoes that run throughout the gospel, repeated over and over again, also help me to see when you're telling the story, there is many times where there's this physical uplifting in the story, even if the words aren't used. People are constantly falling at Jesus' feet, and he's raising them up. All right. One of my, next slide, Lori. One of my good mentors, pairs of mentors, are Joanna Dewey and David Rhodes, and they wrote a book together with Donald Mitchie. And they also talk about this turning that the Gospel of Mark is providing. This is one of my most helpful books in the gospel, or in the genre of the Gospel of Mark. And so I wanted to share these things. But what is the turning from death to life look like? It looks like courage instead of fear. It looks like willingness to lose your life instead of building up your own life. It's about serving others and being willing to be least if that's what's called for. It's about relinquishing power instead of trying to acquire it. And this list that they built by paying attention to the details of the Gospel of Mark, particularly the middle section, chapter 8 to 10. And so it's another kind of lens you can watch as you're doing these stories. What is the turning? If John the Baptist says baptism is about turning, what does that turning look like in concrete and specific ways? Next one, Lori. I have a friend named, I'm sorry if this font is a little small. I have a friend named Ray Pickett, who's a Markan scholar, and he found it very fruitful to not only look at, he also looks at this resurrection theme. And can you go back? Yep. But he also was very interested in what the work of community organizing. And this past month, I've been reading a book called Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown. And I found she's coming out of a different sets of religious traditions than mine, but I found that it had interesting echoes in what Jesus is about in the Gospel of Mark. And so her vision that I also see embodied in Jesus, it looks like this. She says, every small event en route to the larger world we desire should reflect that world. So for example, if I think that the church community should be a joyful and celebrative thing, I should be able to pull off the miracle where our council meetings or our directory or whatever you call your group, they should have that element of storytelling and joy and pleasure in them. Whatever you see as the final vision, the moments that lead up to it should also seek to embody those values. Jesus's ministry and what she's proposing is not about abstract principles, loving all people, caring for all people, but it's about being committed to the people who are in need and vulnerable and have gifts right around you. And so it's always rooted in local, proximate community. I think Jesus acted in that way. It's about adapting and changing to reality with intentionality. So as I said, resurrection doesn't mean just one thing in Mark's Gospels. There's lots of different ways that we're in need of arising. It's about a different way of embodying power. It's power with others, interdependent and not centralized in one person at the top of a pyramid. It's about cultivating resilience in those who are part of a movement, and all those healing stories and the teaching of Jesus and the formation he's offering those who follow him are part of this really essential work of cultivating resilience so that we're not burned out in this process of cooperating with God in the transformation of the world. It's about generating new possibilities, and so that there are things that can happen today that were not possible 3 months ago. and seizing those and moving with those. And it's about imagining your way into a world that is not yet present. And so much of Jesus's vision is projecting this idea of the kingdom of God and what resurrection will look like in a way that is not yet ours. And finally, I find this a really important contribution to what it means to help move a movement, is that Brown says, our work in transformation shouldn't be simply an obligation, a drudgery, but it should be a pleasure. It should be joyful. It should involve, to the extent that that's possible, song and dance and celebration. And all of that seems to me to be in keeping with what Jesus did. People wanted to be around this thing that he was doing, particularly while he was in Galilee. So those are some pieces, some lenses that I hope you can kind of look through as you're doing that. I had two other things I wanted to accomplish here. So if we go to the final slide, I'll move through those real quickly, and then we'll see if there's anything you might like to add. My email is here, and so you're free to contact me if you have questions that we don't get a chance to get to today. I have a YouTube station that if you go on YouTube and look for Phil Ruge-Jones, you'll find it. That's where I have my whole telling of the Gospel of Mark there for free. And I also have about 40 storytellers from the Network of Biblical Storytelling in a group called, in a collection that's called Amazing Storytellers. And so you could check out those if you just want to see different styles and not just one person's style, or if you want to enrich yours. In addition to that, you really should show up on July 30th and 31st, when we have a whole 2 days dedicated to exploring biblical storytelling, its power and possibilities. It's a wonderful spiritual discipline. It's a wonderful way to share the word with people. And you just go to our NBSI website and look for the festival gathering. The cost this year is only the cost of membership, and then you can participate. So it's between $40 and $75 depending upon the demographic you are in, and then the festival gathering is free. I have under my picture on the NBSI website, there is a list of resources that you might find useful in pursuing the Gospel of Mark, and I even threw in some bonus stuff because in the yet lectionary year that focuses on Mark, there is a third of the texts are actually about the Gospel of John, and so I give you some material about the Gospel of John. So I was hoping to go for 45 minutes and then let us talk about those. And so there's two ways, talk about any questions or comments you have. There's two ways we can do this. You could type a question in the chats, and you just click on this little box at the bottom of yours, and there will be a screen that'll pop up, and where it says type message here, you just write your questions. Lori can read them for you, or if you'd like, she may have already seen some questions that you raised, and so she can convey those to us. Or you can type an X and just hit return, and then unmute, and we'll call on you and you can speak. So we'll go for 13 more minutes, and let's see what you got.
So there are a couple questions already. One is about your choice to translate cave crickets instead of locusts.
Yeah, I just think I like some different translations that kind of shake things up. And the New Testament professor at the university that I worked at used that translation. I said, oh, that's cool. I think I'll try that. And it's probably where John was living, is in the caves as hermits did. Carved out places in the rocks in that region. And so I thought that was an interesting choice. And so that's why I did that.
Okay. And Rachel Russell is asking, could we say that the whole scripture has a key message that law and love, justice and mercy together can defeat chaos and brutality?
I think she just did say that, right? I always, even though I'm proposing resurrection as a lens to read the Gospel of Mark from, I'm always looking to see multiple and diverse strands coming together, but that'd be an excellent one that is clearly a theme that appears over and over again in the Gospel, and one that's relevant to our own day.
Carol,
Go ahead.
Carol would like you to say a little bit more about how Mark relates to us in our current predicament.
So I think that it is a gospel that is comfortable with tension and maybe even uncomfortable with too much resolution. And so, and I think that's the place we're going to find ourselves in for months ahead, both in terms of the pandemic and all the dilemmas that raises for us, and in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and our attempts to sort out the history of racism in this country and how we respond to it. And so I see both of those things as being related to in their multiple dimensions throughout the Gospel of Mark. And so, and I trust that you will be holding those things in your heart when you're learning these stories, and there may be some surprises for you about the way different stories connect to the reality as you internalize them. That's one of the beautiful things about, I like to say, we internalize the stories, not so much memorize them and carry them around, and their meaning becomes more apparent to us as we're walking through the struggles of the particular day. Somebody asked about if the PowerPoints are available. If you email me at that email, I can send you the PowerPoint as it is, but on the website, you can download it in a form that just has, there's 12 slides total, and so it has 6 on one side and 6 on another. But if you want the whole thing, you can email me and I'd be happy to share that. So.
I also posted the bibliographic information about the 2 books that you showed us and,
okay.
And your YouTube channel.
Great.
So,
but somebody's like their voice to be heard, and you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
I'm going to share just so you can see this easily. The screen. So this is the NBSI website you can see here, and right here are where the handout and other resources are that you can download. So there's a bibliography, I believe, Phil, right? Yep. And then the slides. So if you want to get those, they are on this NBSI website on this page, the free pre-festival events page.
It's a bibliography, but it's also a list of resources you can access if you're not able to get into libraries these days. And so it has lots of internet resources that you can access, some of which you'll be familiar with, and then some perhaps not.
I'm not noticing any other questions or hands up or anything.
Oh, I see somebody reaching for it, like they might be unmuting.
I just unmuted.
Okay, Debbie.
I don't have a question. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't have a question.
That's all right.
Oh, that's okay.
Statement. I've had a really long day and a rather frustrating one at some points. And I didn't even want to tune in tonight because I just was exhausted and said, I'm done. But I did tune in, and I'm so glad I did. So I just want to publicly thank you, Phil. I just love this, and I can't wait to kind of delve into it a little bit more. So thanks. That's my statement, not a question.
Great, thank you. I like your statement, right? I'm going to like this event even more in about 10 minutes when I'm looking back at it fondly. And the technology just adds a whole nother dimension to it. But I want to do a shout out to Trina, who has been our person who's helped us figure out some of the things we can do in this medium. And it gives me hope that the festival gathering will be a wonderful thing, even though it won't be as lovely as it is when we can sit in the same room.
We had a couple more questions, Phil. One is, Lydia's asking, if I was going to learn one story from Mark, which would you recommend? Good luck.
To me, the key is that you choose a story that you love and seems like the one you want to learn. If it's me, oh man, then it's 2 hours long. It's one story. It's just 2 hours long. But my favorite story is the story of the bleeding woman and Jairus's daughter. And so that's the one I love. It's really two stories wrapped around one. If you poke around enough in my on my YouTube thing, there's a thing called something about Academy for Biblical Storytelling or ABS, and I tell it in there, and so you can see that there.
Okay. And Waverly Road is asking about your method for learning the whole gospel. How did you do that?
So I mapped out a year and a half, actually, yeah, 18 months. And every day I spent 20 minutes with the gospel. And when I thought I had the baptism story down, I went to the very next story. And I just kept doing that every morning, 365 days a year, ideally, for 20 minutes a day. And a key for me was I knew that in 2 years from the time I began, I would be presenting it, because I can't seem to learn a story if I don't have a time when I'm going to present it to other people. I need that little extra push. And so I knew that, and I was like contracted and paid to do that. And so I was working towards that goal. One of the scariest part of that process was about 2 weeks before I was to do this presentation that I'd been working on for 2 years. I had never made it through the whole gospel. I just would get so exhausted about about the time Jesus rides in on a donkey that I just couldn't finish it. And so I'd give myself a rest and come back. And first of all, I think that's part of the story, so that the narrator and Jesus are exhausted by the time you get to the crucifixion thing. I don't think that physical experience is irrelevant to the telling of the story. But I also knew that I needed to be able to get through the whole 2 hours when I was standing in front of the 100 people that were going to gather and the cameras that were going to film it. And so what I did was I allowed myself a little bit of grace, and I had a teleprompter that told me the first sentence of each story. So it would say, and Jesus went to the house of Peter's mother-in-law. And then it would say, healing Peter's mother-in-law, and then the last sentence of the story. And then it would give me the first sentence of the next story. And so by allowing myself, I thought what I realized was I wasn't losing energy by telling the story. I was losing energy because I was worried I was going to forget the next part. And as soon as I freed myself from that anxiety, I was able to go forward. And I looked at the screen 3 times, but I wasn't anxious because I knew I could do that. And it turns out the people who were there, when I asked them, was it distracting when I looked at the screen, they said, there was a screen? We didn't even know, right? And so what I did later, because I didn't want to have a roadie with me doing technology the whole time, was I did a method that's called a house of memory. And so I took a building that I know really well. I taught for 18 years in Langner Hall at Texas Lutheran University. And so I gave a story to each of my colleagues' offices and the classrooms I taught in. And so I knew the baptism was the Spanish lab, and that Margaret's office was the calling of the disciples, and Robin's office was the healing, no, not the healing, was Jesus's challenge in the synagogue about authority, and Robin, likes authority challenging. And so it was good to remember that. And then I went to Beth's office, who loves her mother-in-law so much. And lo and behold, that's where Peter's mother-in-law. And so mentally I could walk through the story. And if I ever got lost, if I ever lost my place, that's where that phrase comes from. I could just say, where was I last? Oh yeah, okay, I was at Pierre's office. That's the paralytic. The next one is, and I could just go on from there. And so that was a really helpful tool for me, and I still use it to this day. We have time for maybe one or two more comments or questions.
Okay, one more question has come in from Jeannie. Say more about the physicality of the story and the new understandings that emerge in encountering Mark's Jesus in contrast to the Jesus in the other Gospels. How is Jesus different?
I can speak about how he is in the Gospel of Mark, but since I didn't learn all the other ones in their wholeness, I can't, I'm not quite as clear about how he's different. But I think the exhaustion thing is a component, that Jesus struggles in the Gospel of Mark, that he asks questions, that my God, why have you forsaken me on the cross, which is in 2 of the Gospels, but it's heartrending, I believe, in Mark's Gospel. And I didn't get a chance to talk about the crucifixion. That's one thing I regret not being able to do a little bit, but I was going to do a 90-minute workshop when we were going to be face-to-face, and something goes in the 45 minutes. If you email me, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. And so the challenge, and I don't have time to explain this, but I think that Jesus is challenged by the Syrophoenician woman, and his own understanding even expands in about who, not the direction his mission should go in, but who all should be included in that. And so there's an excellent book. I have a bunch of my Mark idols behind me here. So let me see if I can grab it. If you're really interested in the characterization of Mark, this is a book by Elizabeth Struthers Malvin. It's not light reading, but it's called Mark's Jesus. And what she talks about is that that the narrator is happy to say that Jesus is the Son of God. But Jesus has a deflecting Christology. He doesn't, as he does say in the Gospel of John, say, it's all about me, come to me, and you will meet the source of abundant life. Instead, whenever somebody asks about himself, he points towards God. And so he's always deflecting attention from himself. And so I think that's a central aspect of Mark. And it's by deflecting attention from himself, it's one of the interesting ways that Jesus actually exercises power. So those are just a couple of examples from Mark's gospel that to me are outstanding. He also is more patient, and that's probably a good thing in these times to learn. Of all the gospels, the disciples in Mark's gospel are the most fallible and confused, and Jesus sticks with them to the end, or at least till they abandon him. And then after that, there's that resurrection story, and he promises, you know what? I'll meet you in Galilee, just like I promised you. Galilee is a place where his ministry has happened, where his teaching has happened, where he's nurtured them into the people they are to be. And so when they return to that, they will experience the presence of the risen Christ in the same way we will when we engage in those same practices.
Hey, it's 8 o'clock, Phil.
Thank you so much. It was really a treat. It's like